What crime is so terrible that history itself erases your name from the victory it could not have won without you? The year is 480 BC. On a narrow strip of coastal road in central Greece, a Persian army surgeon kneels beside a fallen Greek warrior. The surgeon cuts open the dead man's travel pouch. He expects gold, maybe wine rations. Instead, he finds a handful of hard, bitter acorns. He freezes. In the civilized world of the 5th century before Christ, acorns are food for pigs, not men. Yet the corpse on his table did not die of starvation. This man died fighting with the ferocity of a wild animal. The surgeon has just encountered a balanovagus, an acorn eater. This was the insulting nickname the sophisticated Greeks gave to the people of Arcadia. And right now, thousands of these so-called pig eaters are standing on the other side of the wall, screaming for Persian blood. For 25 centuries, the world has been sold a lie, a pristine story about 300 Spartan super soldiers who died defending civilization. The movie posters show them gleaming in bronze, muscles oiled, crimson cloaks snapping in the wind. 300 against 1,000,000, a suicide squad of perfection. But the reality was different. The reality was a gritty, desperate, multicultural meat grinder. The line at Thermopylae was held not just by Spartan discipline, it was held by the savage hunger of the Arcadians, the mountain men, the mercenaries who turned war into a business, the forgotten thousands who did the heavy lifting, while history remembered only the brand name. Why did the world forget them? And what does it say about us that we still believe the lie? To understand, we must go back to the geography of ancient Greece. We must meet the men who marched, and we must follow them into the hot gates, into the blood, into the fire. If you look at a topographical map of the Peloponnese, you will see something extraordinary. In the center of the peninsula, a massive claw of limestone rips through the landscape. Jagged peaks, dense forests, valleys so deep they seem to drop into the underworld. This is Arcadia. While Sparta lounged in the fertile Eurotas Valley and Athens looked outward to the sea, Arcadia was landlocked, mountainous, brutal. The ancient Greeks called it the Switzerland of the ancient world, except there was no neutrality here, and no banks. There was only rock and wolves, and the hardest men in Greece. The Greeks had a saying, if you need a war, buy an Arcadian. For centuries, the primary export of this region was not olive oil, not wine, not pottery, it was violence. The Arcadian economy ran on the blood of its young men. The rocky soil could barely support the population, so the surplus males left their villages and hired themselves out as mercenaries. They fought for tyrants in Sicily, for Persian governors in Asia Minor. Sometimes they even fought against other Greeks. They were the premier hired guns of antiquity, renowned for their grim professionalism, famous for their ability to endure hardships that would break an ordinary soldier. They could march for days on nothing but barley porridge and wild plants. They could sleep on frozen ground without complaint. They could fight through exhaustion that would fell a city-bred aristocrat. Because they had grown up in a fortress. Arcadia is not flatland, it is vertical. The villages cling to slopes so steep that goats slip and fall to their deaths. The trails between settlements wind through forests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the floor. Wolves still hunt in packs. Bears still roam the high meadows. The people who grew up here did not walk to the market. They climbed to it. Their legs were built of iron cords. Their lungs were accustomed to thin mountain air. Their hands were calloused from decades of hauling water up cliff faces and wrestling livestock away from predators. These were not soldiers manufactured in a state gymnasium. These were survivors, hardened by a landscape that killed the weak. The ancient Greeks believed the Arcadians were older than the moon itself. They called them the Proselines. The people who existed before the moon rose in the night sky. It was a way of saying that these mountain dwellers predated civilization, that they remembered a time before cities, before laws, before the gods themselves took their familiar forms. Their patron deity was not Athena, the goddess of strategic warfare. It was Pan, the goat-legged god of the wild, the god of sudden terror, the deity who represented the irrational fear that grips a lonely traveler in deep woods, or a soldier in the chaos of battle. The Arcadians worshipped panic itself, and when they marched to war, they brought that chaos with them. The two largest cities in Arcadia were Tegea and Mantinea. These places hated each other with a passion that usually eclipsed their hatred for outsiders. In any normal year, Tegeans and Mantineans would be killing each other over grazing rights, or border disputes, or ancient grudges nobody remembered the origin of. But 480 BC was not a normal year. By the spring of that year, the world was ending. This was not a vague prophecy. It was a visible, creeping reality advancing from the east. Xerxes, the king of kings, had launched the largest invasion force in human history. The Persian Empire had been planning this for years. After the humiliation at Marathon a decade earlier, when a small Athenian force had somehow defeated a Persian expeditionary army, the empire demanded revenge. King Darius had sworn to burn Athens to the ground. He died before he could fulfill that oath. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the grudge. Xerxes did not plan a punitive raid. He planned a colonization. For 4 years, the Persian state mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale. Engineers bridged the Hellespont with 2 parallel pontoon bridges. Workers dug a canal through the peninsula of Mount Athos so the fleet would not have to risk the dangerous waters that had wrecked an earlier expedition. Supply depots were established along the march route. Diplomatic missions went out to Greek cities demanding submission. The message was clear: submit or burn. Modern historians estimate the Persian land force at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers. The fleet numbered over 1,000 ships. Even the conservative estimates represent an army larger than the entire population of most Greek city-states combined. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing a generation later, claimed the Persian army was so vast it drank rivers dry as it marched. He claimed it took 7 days and 7 nights for the entire force to cross the Hellespont bridges. These numbers are exaggerated, but the terror they reflect was real. Greece had never seen anything like this. Omomo Saporsi. The oracle at Delphi was spitting out doom-laden verses. One prophecy told the Athenians to flee to the ends of the earth. Another told the Spartans that their city would survive only if their king died. Panic was the currency of the day. Cities that had been squabbling for generations suddenly realized they faced extinction. In the autumn before the invasion, representatives from the Greek city-states gathered at Corinth. They formed a defensive alliance. They agreed to put aside their conflicts and face the common threat together. This was extraordinary. The Greeks were not a unified nation. They were a collection of fiercely independent city-states that spent most of their time fighting each other. The Spartans despised the Athenians. The Athenians looked down on everyone else. The Arcadians were considered backward hillbillies by the sophisticated lowlanders. That these groups could agree on anything was remarkable. That they could agree to stand together against annihilation was unprecedented. The alliance needed a strategy. They needed to find a place where the overwhelming Persian numbers would be neutralized, a choke point, a cork to plug the bottle. They found it at Thermopylae. The Hot Gates. Thermopylae was a narrow coastal pass in central Greece, where the mountains plunged almost directly into the sea. In 480 BC, the passage was barely wide enough for a single wagon. At its narrowest point, called the Middle Gate, the path squeezed between sheer cliffs and the waters of the Malian Gulf. If an army could hold this pass, it could stop any force, no matter how large. The Spartans were the obvious choice to lead the defense. They were the acknowledged military masters of Greece. Their army was professional. Their training was legendary. Their reputation terrified enemies throughout the Mediterranean. But there was a problem. When the call to arms went out, Sparta was in the middle of the Carnea, a sacred religious festival honoring Apollo. Spartan law was rigid. no military campaigns during the Carnea. To march to war during the festival was to invite divine wrath. The Spartans had used this excuse before. A decade earlier, they arrived too late for the Battle of Marathon because of a different religious festival. But this time, the threat was too great to ignore. King Leonidas devised a loophole. He framed his departure not as a full army deployment, but as a personal bodyguard mission, an advance guard, a diplomatic token to show the rest of Greece that Sparta was committed. He selected 300 Spartans from the royal bodyguard, the hippies. He chose only men who already had living sons, men whose family lines would not end if they died. Leonidas was a pragmatist. He knew 300 men were useless tactically. They were a symbol, a political statement, a way to keep the alliance together while the main Spartan army prepared to march after the festival ended. But symbols do not hold passes. To actually stop the Persians, Leonidas needed mass. He needed heavy infantry. He needed men who could absorb punishment and keep fighting. He needed the Arcadians. The negotiation that followed was less a diplomatic summit and more a tense standoff. Messengers were dispatched into the Arcadian highlands with a challenge. The Spartans essentially said, "Our king is marching to die for Greece. Are the sons of the bear brave enough to follow, or will you hide in your caves?" It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. The Arcadians, particularly the proud warrior classes of Tegea and Mantinea, could not let their rivals see them as cowards, nor could they let Sparta claim sole guardianship of the Peloponnese. The mountain men had been fighting Spartan aggression for generations. They had battled the Red Cloaks to a standstill more than once. They did not fear Leonidas. They respected him only as a peer. But they also did not trust him. The Arcadians knew how Sparta operated. They suspected Leonidas might use them as a buffer, a fleshy wall to preserve his precious Spartan citizens. In Greek warfare, allies were often placed in vulnerable positions, while the elite troops held the safest spots. Despite the mistrust, the sheer magnitude of the Persian threat forced their hand. The councils of Tegea, Mantinea, Orchomenus, and the smaller Arcadian towns voted to mobilize. They did not send their entire armies. It was harvest season. They too had festivals, but they sent their best. According to Herodotus, 500 hoplites came from Tegea, 500 more came from Mantinea, 120 marched from Orchomenus, another 1,000 came from the rest of Arcadia. In total, more than 2,000 Arcadian heavy infantry joined the march north. For every red cloak in the line, there would be 7 men from the highlands. The muster point must have been a sight to behold. From the south came the Spartans, moving with terrifying silent uniformity, their bronze shields polished to a mirror sheen, their crimson cloaks dyed to the same deep hue. They marched like a single organism, a machine built for war. Then, pouring down from the mountain tracks, came the Arcadians. They were louder, less uniform, a sea of different crests and shield patterns. A wealthy Mantinean noble might stride forward in a full bronze muscle cuirass that rivaled any Spartan's equipment, but the man next to him, a goat herder from a remote village, might wear only a stiffened linen corselet, or perhaps just a thick leather tunic. The great equalizer was the aspis, the large round shield that defined their class as hoplites. Whether bronze-faced or simple ox hide stretched over wood, every man carried one, and in the phalanx, that shield meant everything. There was no warm embrace between these groups. The Spartans looked at the Arcadians with disdain. Uncouth hillbillies, mercenaries, men who would fight for anyone with enough silver. The Arcadians looked at the Spartans with the cynical eye of professional contractors observing a client. They had seen the Spartan mystique up close. They knew these legendary warriors bled just like anyone else. But as both groups looked north, toward the looming threat of Xerxes, those differences had to be shelved. By the time the column reached Thermopylae, the Greek force had grown to approximately 7,000 men. The Arcadians formed the spine of this army, There were also contingents from Corinth, Phlius, Mycenae, Thespiae, Thebes, and other cities. When they arrived at the pass, the reality of the fortress must have been a shock. We tend to imagine Thermopylae as a ready-made castle. It was nothing of the sort. The middle gate was marked by the ruins of an ancient wall, built centuries earlier by the Phocians to keep out raiders from the north. It had fallen into disrepair, crumbling limestone, overgrown with weeds, hardly a barrier for the greatest army on earth. The wall had to be rebuilt immediately. This is where the class divide manifested in labor. While Leonidas and his officers surveyed the terrain and planned the defensive positions, the heavy lifting fell to the common soldiers. The Arcadians and the other allies hauled the massive limestone blocks into place, sweating, cursing, working through the summer heat while the Spartans stood guard. One can imagine the resentment. The acorn eaters were building the cage that would trap them all. Yet this labor served a purpose. It gave the men a physical stake in the ground. They were not just defending a map coordinate, they were defending a wall they had constructed with their own hands. By the time the mortar dried, the Phocian wall stood roughly 6 feet high, just tall enough to break a cavalry charge, just low enough to fight over with a spear. Leonidas also knew about a potential weakness. A mountain path called the Thermopylae wound through the heights above the pass. If the Persians discovered it, they could march around the Greek position and attack from behind. He stationed 1,000 Phocian hoplites on the mountain to guard this route. The trap was set. Now they waited. The arrival of the Persian vanguard was a psychological sledgehammer. Modern historians estimate the Persian force at between 100,000 and 300,000 combatants. The fleet numbered over 1,000 ships. Even the lower estimates represent something unprecedented. For the Arcadians, who had spent their lives in the enclosed valleys of the Peloponnese, the sight was incomprehensible. The Persian camp did not just occupy the plain of Trachis, it consumed it. At night, the campfires of Xerxes' army looked like a reflection of the starry sky. They stretched from the mountains to the horizon. The noise of the camp drifted across the silent Greek lines. The braying of camels, the clatter of foreign tongues, the sheer hum of humanity. Herodotus recorded a famous incident from these days. A Persian scout rode up to the Greek lines to assess their strength. He reported back to Xerxes that he had seen a small group of men exercising and combing their long hair. Xerxes laughed. He thought the Greeks were preparing for a festival. He did not understand that the Spartans always groomed their hair before battle. It was their way of preparing to die. But here is what the scout missed. He only saw the Spartans. They were camped in front of the wall, visible to Persian observers. The thousands of Arcadians and other allies were camped behind the wall, sharpening their weapons, checking their equipment, praying to their gods. The Arcadians were not combing their hair. They were preparing for slaughter. This intelligence failure was critical. Xerxes assumed he was facing a tiny, vain suicide squad. He did not know he was walking into a meat grinder manned by 7,000 desperate heavy infantry. The Arcadians remained the hidden variable in the equation, the submerged bulk of the iceberg. Xerxes waited 4 days. He expected the Greeks to disperse from fear. They did not move. On the 5th day, patience ran out. He sent the Medes and Sicilians first. These were brave men, warriors from the heart of the empire, but tactically, they were walking into a buzzsaw. To understand the slaughter that followed, you must understand what a Greek phalanx actually was. Popular culture depicts ancient battles as a series of heroic duels, individual warriors spinning and slashing in open space. The reality was claustrophobic terror. A phalanx is not a collection of individuals. It is a solid wall of overlapping shields, a bristling hedge of spear points. It operates on the principle of density. The men in the front rank are not fighting alone. They are being physically pinned in place by the men behind them. The entire formation moves as one unit, pushing, grinding, crushing. The Greek hoplite carried a dory, a thrusting spear roughly 8 feet long with an iron tip and a bronze counterweight spike at the other end. The aspis shield was 3 feet wide. When the phalanx locked together, those shields formed a continuous barrier from chin to knee. The Persians charged into this wall. The collisions sounded like a thunderclap, bronze smashing against wicker, wood snapping, men grunting as the breath was knocked from their lungs. The Persian infantry carried shorter spears and lighter wicker shields. Their equipment was designed for mobility and cavalry support, not for this. Not for grinding static warfare against men wearing 60 pounds of bronze. Against the heavy Greek dory, the Maids were hopelessly outmatched. The Spartans took the first shift. They fought with a chilling, robotic efficiency, stabbing over their shields, aiming for eyes and throats, the only vulnerable points on the Persian face. But humans are not machines. Even a Spartan arm tires after hours of thrusting an 8-pound spear. Muscles burn, hydration drops, mental fatigue sets in. This is where the popular narrative fails. The movie version suggests the Spartans fought alone while everyone else watched. The reality was different. Leonidas employed a rotation system. As one contingent tired, another stepped forward. When the Spartan line began to slow, a signal would sound. The Spartans would perform a complex maneuver, opening their files to retreat while the next contingent stepped forward to plug the gap. Tegeans, Mantineans, forward. Now the Persians were not facing the silent, disciplined Spartans. They were facing the bear. The Arcadians slammed into the line with a different kind of energy. If the Spartans were surgical, the Arcadians were brutal. These were men who hunted wild boar with javelins. They brought a raw, guttural aggression to the combat. The men of Tegea, fueled by their ancient rivalry with Mantinea, competed to see who could drop more enemies. The Mantineans, refusing to be outdone, pushed the line forward with reckless force. The killing zone became a slippery mess of mud and blood. The Arcadian spears acted like pistons, stabbing out from behind the wall of shields, retracting, stabbing again. It was rhythmic, industrial, slaughter. For the Arcadian farmers and herders, this was a revelation. They realized that the masters of the world bled just like anyone else. The myth of Persian invincibility shattered against their shields. The acorn eaters found that their diet of hardship had prepared them perfectly for this moment. They did not tire as quickly as the city-bred troops. Their mountain lungs processed the dust-choked air efficiently. As the day wore on, the pile of Persian dead began to create a tactical problem. It was not just a few bodies. It was a rampart of corpses. The Arcadians had to step up onto the bodies of the men they had just killed to maintain the shield wall. The fighting surface became unstable, shifting underfoot with the slickness of gore. Xerxes watched from his golden throne on a nearby hill. Herodotus recorded that the King of Kings leaped from his seat 3 times in terror. He was watching his army evaporate, his Medes, proud warriors who had conquered Assyria and Egypt, being fed into a grinder operated by men he considered barbarians. By late afternoon, the Medes retreated, battered, broken. But the respite was short. Xerxes played his trump card. He signaled for the Immortals. The Immortals were the elite shock troops of the Persian Empire, 10,000 strong, silent, masked, heavily armed. They were called Immortals because whenever one fell, another immediately took his place. The unit always remained at exactly 10,000. They were the stuff of nightmares. To the superstitious Arcadian Highlanders, these were not men. They looked like spirits of the underworld. But when the lines crashed together again, the Arcadians discovered a comforting truth. Spirits do not bleed. Immortals do. This confrontation is where the acorn eaters truly earned their place in military history. When their spears shattered, and they did shatter, snapping like twigs against Persian wicker, the Arcadians did not retreat. They drew their short swords, their heavy curved blades used for butchering meat. They turned the phalanx into a street brawl. There are accounts of Greeks using their teeth, their hands, even rocks when weapons failed. This style of fighting suited the Arcadians perfectly. They were wrestlers, hunters who knew how to grapple with a struggling animal. In the crush of battle, technique mattered less than the will to violence. The Tegeans and Mantineans, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans, butchered the Immortals. They pulled them into the shield wall, stabbed them in the gut, demystified the elite Persian guard. The first day ended not with a Spartan victory. It ended with a Greek coalition victory. The Proselines had proven they belonged on the same stage as the sons of Heracles. But night was falling. The adrenaline would fade, the wounds would stiffen. And the true horror of the hot gates was yet to come. If the first day was fueled by adrenaline, the second day was fueled by horror. By morning, the geography of Thermopylae had fundamentally changed. The narrow pass was no longer paved with dirt and grass, it was paved with meat. Thousands of Persian bodies lay bloating in the Greek summer heat. The stench of decay mixed with the copper tang of blood and the sulfur from the hot springs. The miasma was so thick it could make a veteran retch. Flies arrived in clouds, blackening the air, covering the dead and the living alike. For the Arcadians, men who lived close to the earth, this was a grimly familiar cycle of nature, but magnified to an industrial scale. They wrapped scraps of linen around their faces to filter the air. Their eyes stung from sweat and gore. Xerxes could not understand it. He had thrown wave after wave of his subjects at the wall. The wall had not moved. He assumed the Greeks were exhausted, broken by the trauma. He ordered the Immortals to resume the attack. The second day unfolded like the first, the same grinding horror, the same rhythm of slaughter. But something else was happening in the Greek camp. The class barriers were dissolving. On the march north, the Spartans had looked at the Arcadians with disdain. The Arcadians had viewed the Spartans with suspicion. But after 24 hours of standing in the same blood, those social constructs evaporated. You cannot look down on a man who just saved your life. You cannot envy a man who is vomiting from exhaustion just like you are. We can imagine a moment during a lull in the fighting, a Spartan warrior, his crimson cloak stained black, passing a water skin to a Mantinean farmer, no words needed. The shared trauma forged a bond stronger than any treaty. The impossible alliance had become a brotherhood of the doomed. By the evening of the second day, morale in the Greek camp was surprisingly high. They were tired, wounded, filthy, but alive. They had held the gate against the world. The Arcadians cleaned their weapons, ate their meager rations, perhaps dared to hope that reinforcements would arrive before their strength gave out. They did not know the game was already over. While they celebrated their survival, a local shepherd named Ephialtes was walking toward the Persian camp. He was not carrying a weapon. He was carrying a secret. Ephialtes knew the shape of the mountains better than he knew the concept of honor. He knew about a goat path, a trail called the Thermopylae that wound through the heights above Thermopylae, a path that could bring an army around behind the Greek position. He offered Xerxes the one thing his army of millions could not buy: a back door. The tragedy of the Arcadians is not that they failed to fight. It is that their valor was rendered meaningless by treachery. They had defeated the Persian army on the field, only to be defeated by a handshake in the dark. Under the cover of a moonless night, the Immortals began the ascent, led by their commander Hydarnes, guided by Ephialtes. They moved with the silence of assassins, their armor muffled, climbing the spine of the mountain while the Greek camp below remained oblivious. At dawn, they reached the summit. The 1,000 Phocians stationed to guard this route heard the rustle of thousands of feet in the dry leaves. They scrambled to arms. This was the moment that decided the war. If the Phocians had held their ground, if they had blocked the narrow track, the Immortals would have been bottled up. The flanking maneuver would have failed. But the Phocians made a catastrophic decision. Seeing the massive Persian force, they assumed they were the primary target. Panic took the wheel. Instead of holding the choke point, They retreated to a nearby hill to make a defensive stand, preparing to die. Hydarnes must have laughed. He did not care about the Phocians. He ignored them completely. He simply marched his men past the confused defenders and began the descent toward the rear of Leonidas's position. The door was not just unlocked. It had been left wide open. Back at the coast, the first warning came with the morning light. Lookouts spotted the glint of armor moving down the mountainside behind them. The realization hit the camp like a physical blow. The impossible had happened. They were flanked. Leonidas called a final council of war. The captains of the various city-states were shouting, arguing, pointing fingers. Why stay? To stay was suicide. For the Arcadians, the situation was particularly bitter. They had done everything asked of them. They had bled. They had held the line. They had proven their worth. Now, because of a failure by the Phocians on the mountain, they were trapped. The phalanx is a directional weapon. It is designed to face forward. It cannot fight an enemy coming from behind. This moment defined the leadership of Leonidas. He did not order a mass suicide. He understood that the Greek coalition was the only army standing between Xerxes and the rest of Greece. If the entire force of 7,000 men died here today, there would be no one left to defend the isthmus, no one to fight at Plataea. So he made a decision that has been misinterpreted for millennia. He did not just decide to stay. He decided to dismiss the bulk of the army. This was not martyrdom, it was tactical sacrifice. Someone had to stay behind. Someone had to hold the pass long enough for the rest of the army to escape. If everyone ran at once, the Persian cavalry would chase them down on the open plains. A rear guard was necessary. Leonidas stayed with his 300, but he was not alone. 700 Thespians, led by their general Demophilus, refused the order to leave. They chose to stay and die, an act of voluntary sacrifice that rivals, and perhaps exceeds, that of the Spartans, who were bound by law to remain. The Thebans stayed too, though Herodotus suggests many of them were held as hostages and later surrendered. The main Arcadian columns formed up to march south. Not in flight. In disciplined retreat. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The Tegeans and Mantineans looked at their Spartan counterparts with a mixture of awe and devastation. They were leaving the hot gates not as victors, but as survivors. As they marched out of the pass, the sound of their departure must have been haunting. The rhythmic thunder of thousands of feet moving away from the enemy. Every step took them closer to safety, and further from honor. They had to listen to the silence of the men left behind. They knew that within hours, every man they had shared bread and water with would be dead. This retreat birthed a profound psychological scar. The march back to the Peloponnese was a funeral procession for their pride. When they arrived home in Tegea and Mantinea, how were they received? They were alive, yes. They brought their shields back, technically fulfilling the hoplite code of with it or on it. But the context was hollow. They had to look into the eyes of their wives and children. They had to explain that the king was dead, the pass had fallen, and they had walked away. The story of the 300 began to spread almost immediately, engineered by the Spartan survivors, amplified by poets and playwrights. The narrative solidified within a generation. Sparta gave everything. The allies gave up. The Arcadians were erased from the hero's edit. But this shame served a purpose. It acted as a compression chamber for their rage. The Arcadians did not dissolve into pacifism. They went home and sharpened their spears again. They understood something the poets missed. Leonidas did not send them home to retire. He sent them home to prepare. The survival of the Arcadians at Thermopylae was the only reason a Greek army existed to fight later. If 7,000 Greeks had all stayed and died, Xerxes would have rolled over the rest of the peninsula with ease. The Arcadian retreat was the ultimate act of discipline, suppressing the ego's desire for a glorious death in favor of the strategic necessity of a future victory. They carried the memory of the hot gates with them like a burning coal. They remembered the arrogance of the Immortals. They remembered the face of Ephialtes. And most of all, they remembered the sacrifice of the Thespians and Spartans. They owed a blood debt. And in the ancient world, blood debts were always paid. 1 year later, the summer of 479 BC, the setting shifts from the narrow cliffs of Thermopylae to the rolling plains of Plataea in Boeotia. Here, the final fate of the Western world would be decided. If Thermopylae was a skirmish, this was Armageddon. The Greek coalition had assembled the largest hoplite army ever seen, nearly 40,000 heavy infantry, a total force strength approaching 80,000 men when counting light troops and support personnel. Among them stood the survivors of Thermopylae, the men of Arcadia, burning with a year's worth of shame and fury. The Persian general Mardonius had been left behind by Xerxes with a substantial army. Modern estimates put his force at around 100,000 soldiers. He had spent the winter in Thessaly. In the spring, he had burned Athens again. Now he waited at Plataea, hoping to destroy the Greek army in a decisive battle. Before the first spear was thrown, a heated diplomatic incident occurred that tells us everything about the Arcadian mindset. The Tegeans demanded the place of honor on the left wing of the army. They argued with the Athenians. They cited ancient deeds and mythological victories. They were not acting like a defeated people. They were acting like predators demanding the best seat at the feast. The bear was awake, and it was hungry. They eventually conceded the left wing to Athens, taking their place next to the Spartans on the right. But the message was sent. The acorn eaters had not forgotten who they were. The Battle of Plataea began in chaos. For days, the two massive armies danced around each other, plagued by supply issues and thirst. The Persian cavalry harassed the Greeks constantly. It was a miserable, dusty stalemate. Then came the breaking point. The Spartans and Tegeans found themselves isolated on a ridge, facing the main body of the Persian infantry. The Persians planted their shields in the ground, forming a barricade, and they unleashed a storm of arrows so thick it darkened the sky. Here, Herodotus records a moment of excruciating tension. Pausanias, the Spartan regent commanding the army, refused to give the order to charge. He was stuck in a religious loop, sacrificing goat after goat, waiting for favorable omens from the gods. Meanwhile, men were dying. Arrows rained down on the crouching hoplites. The Tegeans had had enough. While the Spartans prayed, the Tegeans acted. In a display of raw, insubordinate courage, the Tegeans rose from behind their shields. They did not care about the omens. They cared about the blood debt they owed to Leonidas. With a roar that must have echoed off the ghostly peaks of Thermopylae, they charged the Persian line first. Seeing their allies surge forward, the Spartans finally dropped their religious scruples and joined the rush. But make no mistake, the Arcadians initiated the contact. The collision was catastrophic for the Persians. The heavy Greek hoplites smashed through the wicker shield wall like a sledgehammer through glass. The pent-up aggression of the Tegeans was unleashed in a frenzy of close-quarters violence. They were not fighting for strategy anymore. They were fighting for catharsis. Every Persian they cut down was a payment for the friends they had left at the hot gates. The battle turned into a rout. Mardonius was killed. According to Herodotus, a Spartan named Arimnestus crushed his skull with a rock. The leaderless Persian mob fled back to their fortified wooden stockade. And this is where the Arcadians delivered their final, undeniable statement. The Spartans, for all their prowess in open battle, were notoriously bad at siege warfare. They reached the Persian stockade and stalled, unable to breach the walls, hacking uselessly at the timber. Then the Tegeans arrived. The men of the mountains, accustomed to rough terrain and manual labor, they tore into the fortifications. Herodotus explicitly credits the Tegeans with bursting open the gate. They shattered the wood, created the breach, allowed the flood of Greek rage to pour inside. What followed was not a battle. It was an extermination. The Greeks, fueled by the memory of Athens burning and Thermopylae falling, showed no mercy. Of the 100,000 Persians who supposedly started the campaign, only a fraction escaped alive. The Tegeans stood amidst the carnage, covered in gore, breathing the heavy air of victory. They had done it. They had returned to the field, faced the same enemy, and this time, they did not have to walk away. They had broken the wall that the Spartans could not break. In the aftermath, the Greeks erected a monument at Delphi to commemorate the victory, the Serpent Column, a bronze pillar shaped like 3 intertwined snakes. Originally, it supported a golden tripod dedicated to Apollo. On its coils, the names of the city-states were inscribed. Tegea is there, Mantinea is there, Orchomenus is there. Etched alongside Sparta and Athens, they earned that engraving with iron and blood. The ghosts of the 300, the 700 Thespians, and the forgotten Arcadians who died at the Hot Gates could finally rest. Redemption was complete. So we return to the question that started this journey. If the Arcadians fought so bravely, if they provided the mass that held the line at Thermopylae and the rage that broke the wall at Plataea, why do we only remember the 300? The answer lies in the machinery of historical memory. History is not a recording of what happened. It is a recording of what people chose to remember. And in the ancient world, nobody curated their own brand better than the Spartans. Sparta was the first state to weaponize silence as a marketing tool. They practiced laconism, the art of speaking in short, pithy, memorable one-liners. When asked to surrender their arms, Leonidas did not send a diplomatic letter explaining his political reasons. He reportedly said 2 words, molon labu, come and take them. It was a soundbite designed to echo through the ages. The Arcadians, by contrast, were not poets or philosophers. They were acorn eaters. They did not leave behind a repository of witty quotes. They left behind dented shields and broken spears, artifacts that do not translate well into oral tradition. Furthermore, Spartan propaganda was extraordinarily effective. After the war, Sparta used the legend of Thermopylae to justify their dominance over the rest of Greece. They spun the narrative that they alone had saved civilization. The death of Leonidas became political currency that bought them deference for decades. Admitting that they needed the help of thousands of hillbillies to hold the pass would have devalued their brand of superhuman superiority. So they simply omitted the details. This distortion was cemented by later historians and artists, from Herodotus, who actually tried to be fair but was seduced by the Spartan mystique, to modern graphic novels and blockbuster films. The lens has always focused on the Crimson Cloak. It is cleaner to tell a story about a few perfect heroes than a messy army of thousands. But this erasure has consequences. When we ignore the Arcadians, we endorse a dangerous fallacy. The great man theory of history. We start to believe that civilization is shaped only by kings and elites, while the common people are just background scenery. The reality of Thermopylae is far more inspiring than the myth. It is the story of a coalition. It is the story of the Tegeans and Mantineans who put aside their ancient hatred for the greater good. It is the story of the Thespians who stayed to die when they did not have to. It is the story of the vast, silent majority who did the heavy lifting, built the walls, took the arrows, so that the stars could shine. The Arcadians at Thermopylae represent the unsung essential workers of history. They are the ones who show up, do the dirty work, and go home without a parade. They remind us that courage is not the monopoly of the famous. Today, if you visit Thermopylae, you will see a massive statue of Leonidas. It is the center of attention. Tourists photograph it from every angle. But if you look nearby, there is a monument to the Thespians, a statue of Eros, the god of love, headless and tragic. And if you look even harder into the dust and rocks of the pass itself, you might feel the presence of the others. We cannot build a statue for every Arcadian who died there. We do not even know most of their names. But we can offer them something better. The truth. We can correct the record. We can say clearly that the 300 were never alone. They stood on the shoulders of the bear. History is a vast, dark room for centuries. We have pointed our flashlight only at the spots where the gold glitters, at the kings and generals, at the famous last words and the dramatic deaths. It is time we started shining it into the corners, where the iron lies rusting, where the acorn eaters stood their ground. Today, the plain of Plataea is farmland. Wheat grows where the Tegeans charged. Olive trees stand where the Persian stockade burns. If you dig down a few feet, you might still find arrowheads, or fragments of shield rims, or the bones of men who died 25 centuries ago. The land remembers what the poets forgot. And every spring, the wildflowers return. Character count, approximately 3,400 characters.